guys, so I come to you today from my sofa trying to just like stay a little bit comfortable. It's Sunday, I've been in bed with the cold the past few days, so you know, taking it easy but still wanting to chat about books. And today I'm going to tell you all about the books I've read in the first half of this month, which is February. That always stumps me. But I've read quite a few books in this first half of the month. Some I loved, some I didn't love, but I wanted to review them for you and chat about them with you, so without further ado, let's just jump straight in. First up, let's talk about The Mysterious Howling. This is the first book in the Incorrigible Children of Ashton Place series by Mary Rose Wood, and it's a middle grade children's book series that I had heard about a long time ago. It's been on my wish list for quite a few years. I'm sure I've seen it on people's channels like way back in the day on BookTube, but as I've been reading more and more middle grade over the past sort of year or so, I finally picked it up when I realised it was on Scribd, so I could read the ebook on Scribd and I have a subscription, etc, etc. Basically the circumstances were right to basically read this book, and I am so glad that I did. I love this book like way more than I was even expecting to. I wanted something light and easy to kind of read in the evening, like right before I went to sleep, because I was finding it difficult to relax, and I thought like a middle grade children's book would help with that. And it was just the absolute perfect thing. It did help me relax, but it was also such an engaging story with such interesting characters and written in such a fun way. Like the tone was really enjoyable. The book itself is set during the Victorian era, and it follows Miss Lumley, a 15-year-old girl who's just graduated from her like school slash like orphanage. She was raised and trained there to be a governess, and she's got her first position at this like big old manor house in the English countryside, taking care of 3 young children. I can't remember exactly, but I think they're around like 7, 5 and 3, 2 boys and a little girl. Now, the children aren't actually the biological children of the Lord and Lady of this manor, they're wards. The man, Lord Ashton, found them in the woods one day when he was out hunting, and he almost shot them, which he doesn't actually seem that concerned about. But it turns out they've been living like wolves. It seems that they've been raised by a wolf. They've not for a very long time at least had any interaction with humans, and Miss Lumley has to take on the role of sort of teaching them Latin and how to interact with strangers at parties, and it's such good fun. There is just like the everyday enjoyment and like adventure of the story, which is like Miss Lumley training these interesting, if slightly wild young children and getting to know them, finding a new place in the world after having been raised in this orphanage slash school, putting her training to the test. And she's quite like a pragmatic, sensible young woman. She's not easily phased, and she kind of just gets on with her work. And even though she's got slightly unusual wards, she's still reading them German poetry whilst also training them not to chase squirrels, and it's a lot of fun in that respect. But there's also this layer of mystery, like where did these children come from? Is there something like otherworldly about them? Like this book wasn't fantastical per se, but it is one of those books where you feel like there could be a paranormal aspect to the mystery once you've gotten to the bottom of it, but I don't obviously have the answers yet, and I literally don't have any answers because nothing is revealed in book 1. But strangely that didn't bother me. Like the book basically ends at a point where more mystery has been introduced, and we're wondering if there's people rooting against these little children, but you literally get no answers. Like nothing is revealed in book 1. And in the abstract, I would assume that I wouldn't like that. I'd want some answers, if still some new mysteries to carry on into book 2. But it really didn't bother me. I think it added to the fun, and it also made me immediately start reading book 2. So I've already started book 2, which I think is The Hidden Place, as that's also on Scribd. And I'm now reading that in the evenings and really enjoying it. Again, we've got new characters being introduced, and I'm really enjoying getting to know all of them, but still I really don't know anything about where these children came from, and it's so fascinating. I think there's quite a few books in this series, so I really think I'm going to enjoy following the adventures of Miss Lumley and these 3 children throughout the story and eventually kind of getting some answers. But for now I'm just enjoying the journey, and the tone, like I mentioned, is just really fun. It has the kind of same sensible, pragmatic approach that Miss Lumley does. So occasionally the omniscient narrator will interject with like little tidbits about the difference between Miss Lumley's life in Victorian England and modern day life for readers, and it really works. I don't know how to explain how that works, but it does. It feels like you're having like a real history recounted to you, even if it's incredibly odd, and it really makes the most of that like Victorian setting. So all in all, I love this book. I'm so pleased to have been introduced to a new middle grade series that I'm enjoying, and I can't wait to carry on. I then read a book that I'm far more on the fence about, and that is The Winter King by C.L. Wilson. This is the first in a fantasy romance series, with each book, I believe, following a different sister in a family and her romance. Although I'm sure the characters from the first book will appear in book 2 because of like the overarching like political backdrop. However, I'm undecided whether I'm going to read book 2. I want to like C.L. Wilson, mainly because she writes really like epic romance fantasy. So her books are romances, like the relationship between the man and the woman are very, very central. That is like the crux of the story. But she doesn't give up on like world building or sacrifice world building or like the magical system or the political backdrop to the romance. That is just as integral and so detailed. And I want more books like that in, I think, like the vein of like Jacqueline Carey, whose Nama's Kiss series. I read the first book in quite a while back and adored. This book I actually picked up because I think Goodreads said if you like one, you'll like the other. Maybe I should just go back and reread Nama's Kiss because that was like years ago and I keep meaning to reread it so I can continue on with the series. And it is romance but complex fantasy world, which yes is true of The Winter King, and I really feel like the book delivered on like setting, magic, world building, like big dramatic plot points, like real high stakes and all of those elements. However, I did not like the hero or the male lead that was part of the relationship. So we follow a princess who has grown up in an incredibly abusive household. Like, she's the youngest child and her father hates her and he treats her abominably. There's so much violence, well, there's violence throughout the book, but I think the violence in the first sort of 20% is particularly stark because it is like a father being incredibly violent to his child, and that was really difficult to read. So she's obviously had this terrible life thus far, and now she's around 20 or so, and basically she is like traded in a sort of like peace bargain after a war to this Winter King who wants a princess from the kingdom he's conquered in order to like beget his heirs upon. And he's not really interested in love, and it's quite like a threatening, manipulative relationship at the beginning. However, obviously it's a romance, so you know, they are incredibly attracted to one another. Their lust overwhelms their feelings of hatred towards one another, and they do develop this sort of like innate loyalty that gradually grows into love. But particularly for the first 50%, I found the whole dynamic really uncomfortable because there was a real imbalance in the power between our female and our male leads. Now, I liked the female lead. I thought she was like a complex person with like a rough background who was making the best of her situation, and our male protagonist also had like his history and horrible things that happened, but he still had the power in the relationship and took advantage of it, and I didn't like that. Now, by around 60%, he was starting to like grow on me, like I was warming to him a little bit, but I never really came around to him 100%. I don't know if it's just the way the relationship started or the way I felt like he handled the beginning of their relationship, but throughout the book I never like fully rooted for their romance because I didn't love him. I kind of just wished he was a different person. So that was really unfortunate. But because there were elements I liked about the series, I would still like to maybe try something else by this author. I know she has another series that's really popular, so I might read the first book in that. And I'd love to hear from you if you've read more of her books and kind of, and if there are any of them that you think perhaps I'll like the like lead romance dynamics in more than I did with this one, because it just had me feeling a little bit uncomfortable throughout most of it. Or of course in general, if you've read any other authors in the vein of like Jacqueline Carey or C.L. Wilson who write like epic fantasy romances, would love your recommendations. I then read a very short little book called Rhetoric, a very short introduction by Richard Toye. So this is from the Oxford Very Short Introduction series, which take like what do I say, like an abstract concept like rhetoric. There's ones on like Egyptian mythology or classical mythology. I've gone down the mythology route there, but there's ones on kind of everything, you know, all disciplines really, and they take a topic and they kind of give you an overview of that topic from like an academic but accessible perspective. So this book for me read as a sort of like, what is the function of rhetoric in society, providing a little bit of a history to the way rhetoric has changed over the centuries, or where rhetoric began, and kind of people's attitudes towards rhetoric, how it's used, and like I mentioned, its sort of function in society. And if you do or don't know, I study rhetorical texts as for my PhD. Like my PhD is solely focused on pieces of rhetoric from the Athenian democracy. So I just thought it would be nice from an academic perspective to just read this kind of more like overview on the subject itself, because this is more like Richard Toye's expertise. He's not a classicist, his expertise are rhetoric. So he talks about rhetoric throughout time with a lot of particularly modern examples, or a lot of 20th and early 21st century examples. And overall I thought this was a good book. It delivered what I would have wanted from it. I think it would make a good introduction to the topic for some people, and actually if it's for educational purposes, it had a lot of like, try out these techniques for writing your own rhetoric, which wasn't why I wanted to read the book, but like that's fun from a learning and teaching perspective if you're more interested in how to be an orator. I mean, we can all do with like improving our speech, right? But like, just if you're really focused on that, it's got that element to it as well. And then for me, it just was like taking a step back from my subject and seeing an element of my subject from a broader perspective, which I still think is really beneficial and really interesting. So I like this. I think it's a really great little series of books on different topics. None of them are ever just like, this is a history of a topic. It is like an introduction into a discipline. So it looks at it from different perspectives. Some from a practical perspective, some from like a historical perspective, sometimes from like a methodological perspective, what have you. I do think they're beneficial, especially if you're just sort of getting into a topic. I then read a book that I recently talked about as well, and that is Weather by Jenny Ofel. So I filmed a video a few videos ago that was recommending books that deal with climate change and the environment, and I would love it if you would go and watch that video if you haven't already, because I think it's such an important topic, and I would love more recommendations of books dealing with those subjects, whether they be fiction or non-fiction. So I'll link it down below if you haven't seen it already. And one of the books I mentioned in that video was Weather, which is a new release in the sort of literary fiction genre. So Jenny Ofel has written quite a few books actually. I'd never read any of them before, but she gets really high praise for her prose, and I can completely understand why. She's a really engaging writer, and I found that throughout this book. It's kind of like snippets into one woman's mind as she is going through the motions of life. She is a librarian who has recently gotten a part-time job as an assistant to one of her old professors that runs a podcast all about the climate change and the environment. So she like goes with her on tour to go to talks. She also answers all of her emails from people inquiring about the podcast. So those could be emails from people who are like climate change deniers. They could be emails from people who are like lifelong climate change activists, and kind of the way she has to process all of that information in her everyday life. She's very aware of the science surrounding global warming and its impact on our world and our impact on climate change itself, and how imminent a threat the like changing environment of the planet is. But at the same time, she's also just like trying to like take care of her son and earn a living and be in a relationship with her husband and her friends and support her brother, who's not always like completely on top of things, and all the other aspects of life. And it's about her balancing that knowledge with her life, and it's really interesting. I think it's very thought-provoking and comes at an issue from an angle that a lot of us can relate to, so I really enjoyed that. I then, as you very well know, I'm sure, read 4 more books. Well, one was a short story, not really a book, and those were all what are deemed Highlander romances. So I did a whole video this month called An Actual Scot Reads Highlander Romances. Highlander romances are basically a subgenre of the historical romance genre, but that involve Scottish men or women. It's like basically romances with kilts. And I thought it would be fun as a Scottish person to read some of those and give you my thoughts, and I filmed like a 40-minute long video, which was really enjoyable. I mean, it was like a lot of work, but I really enjoyed making it, and I'm so pleased at how many of you have enjoyed watching it, so I will link that down below if you haven't seen it. But I ended up finishing 4 things in that book. I DNF'd 2 and finished 4, but I won't go into terrible amounts of detail about them there because I talked so much about them in this other video. I'll just like briefly tell you what they were. In the order of my favourite to least favourite, I think. So, well, I didn't hate any of the ones I finished because otherwise I would have DNF'd them. But the one I did love the most was The Madness of Lord Ian McKenzie by Jennifer Ashley, which is the first in the Mackenzies and McBride's series. And this one I think was set in the Victorian era from what I remember, and it's set across London, Paris and Scotland. I can't remember whereabout in Scotland they said they visited at one point, but you know, we jump around a lot, and in a lot of ways it kind of wasn't that cliched Highlander romance. But setting anything about like Scotland and historical accuracy aside, I just love this book for the 2 lead characters, Beth and Ian, who are obviously the central romance. And Ian is actually autistic, so they don't use the word in the book because the word didn't exist when the book is set, but the author has very explicitly acknowledged that he is autistic, and it's made very clear throughout the book without using the word, and I thought it was done really well. Again, I'm not autistic, so it's always difficult to say how accurate something is from my perspective, but from reading other people's reviews that maybe know more than me or have personal experience in that area, they seem to think it was accurate. And then I also just thought it read very sensitively, and I loved him as a character, and I loved him and Beth's relationship. Beth was also like a widow, so she wasn't this virginal young woman who'd never been in a relationship before. She'd actually already had a really healthy, loving marriage prior to meeting Ian, and that was really nice to read about as well. I just think in a lot of ways it was a little bit different from what I've read elsewhere in this genre, and I loved it. I then read When a Scot Ties a Knot by Tessa Dare. This is the 3rd book in her Castles Ever After series, and this one was good fun again. This one was actually set in Scotland. I think it was set in Inverness from what I remember, and I've generally speaking liked the 2 main characters. It's not my favourite Tessa Dare book I've read so far, but it did have one of the best premises, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. That's one of the things I love about Tessa Dare's Regency romances, is their sense of humour. Like, Tessa Dare is just both so funny as well as just like a writer who can create really endearing characters who are often dealing with stuff from their past that's impacting them in the present, and she always tries to explore that throughout the book, and I really enjoy that. I also think her lead characters always have so much more to them than just their romance, and that's something again that Tessa Dare does really well. And in this one, like I mentioned, the concept which I loved so much is that our female lead is agoraphobic, so doesn't want to go to balls or be introduced to lots of strangers, and in order to get out of all of those society obligations, makes up a fiancé. She pretends she has this fiancé who is this like Highlander that's off fighting in the Napoleonic Wars, and she like writes letters to him and then writes fake letters back from him to fool her family, thinking that the letters she's writing to him will never go to anyone because she made this person up, right? Turns out she picked a name that exists and is a soldier in the British Army, and for years now he's been receiving her letters. So at the beginning of the book he turns up and is like, "Hey honey, I'm home." And I loved that. I just thought it was so much fun. But naturally, as in romance, they often bring out the best in one another, and the relationship became really lovely, and overall just really enjoyed it. I then read Mad for Love, book 1 in the Highland Bride series by Elizabeth Essex. This one was fun. It was a bit shorter. It was only 180 pages, so more of a novella. And we follow a French aristocratic woman who moved to London with her father because of the French Revolution. And her father is like a art forger, so he's like he's an incredible painter, and he's been forging masterpieces, and because of this basically she needs to steal a forgery in order that her father doesn't get found out, and she enlists the help of this like aristocratic Scottish man that also lives in London to help her steal it, and it's like this heist storyline, and obviously they end up falling in love with one another. It was good fun, and I don't know if it's just because it was like a little bit shorter or what, but I didn't quite fall in love with the characters in the ways I did in the other 2 books I just mentioned, but you know, it was like a bit of an adventure. Not a new favourite, but an enjoyable romp. And then lastly for that video I read Agnes Moore's Wild Night, which was a short story by Alyssa Cole, and this one is about a young black woman in the court of King James IV of Scotland, so this is before the Union of the Crown, and her falling in love with this Highland chieftain, although it's not really like the story of them falling in love because it's 38 pages. They are just in love at first sight. Like it's just a little story basically about these two people who spotted each other one night, fell in love, and eventually come back together and have sex and then get married. Like, that is what the story is about. But it was cute and I liked the way it was written. There's not much to say about it because it's so short. I didn't dislike it. I thought it was like a nice way to wrap up that video. And that brings us to the end of this video. Those are all the books I've read in the first half of February. I feel like I read quite a few in particular because of the Highlander Romance video, which I was really like powering through my reading during. But I will link any videos I've mentioned in the description box down below, as well as all of the books. I'd love to hear from you if you've read any of these books or any books by these authors and have any recommendations or are interested in chatting about any of them. But until next time, happy reading and I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys!